Okay, we're live. Awesome. Good evening, good night, guys. Good night's a goodbye. Good evening is what I'm gonna go with. Usually we do this in the afternoon, but I have started work at my library, and Tuesday is the day that I work the night shift, which means that I will be at work until 8 o'clock. So if we do these again, which I believe we will in the future, they'll probably be like 9:30-ish. So apologies for people who want to be in bed right now, but we're here and we're going to be chatting. Today we wanted to discuss the genre hierarchy because both Gretchen and I have made videos recently where we sort of discuss discrepancies in how certain genres are viewed by the public, and how people like on BookTube will talk about things differently or will treat people differently if they enjoy certain kinds of books because of the sort of stigmas that go around that. And we wanted to discuss why we thought that was and what exactly we think the hierarchy is and if there are differences in different things. So yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about today. You have anything to add, Gretchen?
No, you've basically encapsulated everything. Just that my name is Gretchen and I am here.
Hi, Gretchen. All right. So I would say that the first thing that we need to do is to say what we think the hierarchy is of like genres and where they sit sort of together. Do you want to go first?
Okay, sure. So I think there's a different hierarchy versus like perception versus what people actually read. Okay. Because I feel like for me, if I'm discussing a hierarchy of perception, and that classics and literary are definitely up there. Like if you're reading those kinds of things, that's what's the what. And then like after that, there's this really big wall, and then there's genre fiction. And I'll explain why I'm not talking about general adult fiction in a second, because there's this huge wall, and then you get, I feel like as far as genre, fantasy and sci-fi are at the top, you can still find really you can really be respectable if you're reading like Ursula K. Le Guin or stuff like that, Neil Gaiman, whatever. And then after that, it trickles down, like Westerns and mysteries kind of get lost in the muddle and other things like that. And then there's a stigma attached to reading either like romance or young adult literature. I would argue that children's literature actually sits above young adult literature in like, because there's a lot more like classic children's literature, and children's literature often strays less from what it is expected to be. And I didn't mention general fiction because I feel like that is this moderate category that no one ever talks about, so you never hear about it. And It's just like this wishy-washy space where some people will claim like, no, it's actually literary fiction or it's genre fiction, or like people just don't care.
Unless it's
like
chick-lit,
so it's like
the safe on the bottom. Because chick lit goes in the general fiction section, but that's also kind of frowned upon.
Yeah. Less so than it used to be.
But yeah.
Like, and also a lot of chick lit now is romance. Like if it has a girly cover, it doesn't matter if they're null. I will lump that in with like the romance.
I would say that's fair, although
that's how I feel.
Some of my favorite chick lit books are found in the fiction section, and it's marked as chick lit because the protagonists are women and it involves women's issues. So it's a specific book like, what do I have over there? Okay, Saving CC Honeycutt is a chick lit book. It's written by Beth Hoffman. It's one of my favorite books, and she's one of my favorite authors, and she's actually commented on the review I did of that book on my blog, which I can retroactively link here if you want to hear about it. But that one has a female child protagonist who goes and lives with her female aunt, and it involves this aunt or grandmother, I'm not sure, I read it several years ago, and like all of these women in this neighborhood. So it's all of these female characters and this female child growing up surrounded by this and seeing all these different people in different ways. and that's chick lit, and it's sort of not viewed as high literature because of the fact that it's about women.
Okay, I think the issue is just that you and I have different ideas of like what the term chick lit means.
Okay.
Because like that to me, honestly, and the way that I've seen chick lit labeled, packaged, marketed, and put out, like that honestly sounds like something that is more of my idea of like general. Because chick lit books have a very, like, to me, they're a very particular look.
So here's
of
the
book, like
that description would make you think, okay, yes, general fiction, but you can buy that book at the grocery store. And that's
a whole other thing, though.
That's like the thing, though, right? Is that, so, okay, this goes into another thing where, like, books that you can buy in the grocery store in the mass market paperback, which generally are mysteries and romance and chick lit, are viewed less. And they're there because the mothers and women are going to the grocery store, or, you know, gender norms / things that aren't necessarily true, but the book section of your grocery store is going to have those types of books, or like Walmart or whatever. Same books are there, and they're very cheap, and they're small and compact and all of that stuff. So yes, that's another thing.
Yeah.
I didn't give my hierarchy, so maybe I should do that, and then we can move on.
Yeah, do that.
I agree for the most part with Gretchen, with that classics and literary fiction are up here. And I would say classics go above literary fiction because people in school, if they were, because like Gretchen and I have had this discussion a lot where we both prefer contemporary and modern writing more than we like classics. And by that, I mean we don't really like classics all that much. And if somebody said, oh, I only read Renaissance literature because I love it so much, and I said, oh, I like to read modern classics and literary fiction, they would go, oh. And I'm like, oh? So classics would go above literary fiction, but literary fiction is still up there as like, this is the new stuff that might eventually become a classic. So it's this high literature. It has a bar for entry. Not everybody's going to be reading it. Underneath that, I would actually agree with you and say that fantasy and science fiction kind of go above like general fiction, just because there are those sort of classics that are there, but they are definitely below the literary fiction because there's this idea that genre fiction in general is just fluff. It doesn't make you think about anything, which is not true at all. But again, that's the perception. And then the general fiction would go, and then underneath that I would put Western and mysteries because they're like those mass market paperbacks that you get. And then under that would be romance, erotica, and young adult literature. And children's literature I would put above even like romance, and like probably maybe even above mysteries. Maybe not. They're like about on par with mysteries because I don't know. Even with me, I feel like I would be more willing to read a children's book or a juvie book or whatever you're going to call it or categorize it than I would to pick up a YA book that looks like it's just a cookie cutter YA book, right? Does that make sense? Because there's so much more diversity in children's books, and it's sort of accepted there. So yeah, there's that. That's my hierarchy, and that's what I see as the perceived hierarchy, not necessarily like writing wise or whatever. Because like I said, there's issues with this, but that's what I think.
Genre doesn't really exist anymore, except as like a marketing concept. It never really did.
That's fair.
It's so, and I would also say too that our perceptions, like I was just saying before we went live, our perceptions really matter about our location. Because especially if you are in an academic environment, well, like I am and you just left, especially there, the emphasis is so much on classics and literary fiction. And I can imagine people being in a different environment where like those things are kind of looked down upon for being stuffy or old or like being like hoity-toity. So like there is a really easy way to be in a situation where your perception of the hierarchy is reversed in a certain way.
I should also mention that graphic novels and comics are pretty down there as well. because so I tomorrow have a meeting with my director of the library to discuss some things. One of those is how she wants me to use the social media for the library. So if you want to follow those, I'll maybe talk about that at a future time. But the other thing is to talk about getting more graphic novels for adults. They have a lot of graphic novels for teens and for kids, but like maybe 7 for adults. So it's kind of ridiculous. And the idea is that nobody's going to read it because graphic novels aren't for adults. That's childish. It's for kids. So I would say that goes pretty low on the totem pole as well. Because it's got pictures, guys. You don't need to think about anything when you're reading comics. Rude.
And I'm just remembering this now, but I totally forgot. So you guys may know that we do a series while we've been at school this past year called Imbibliomancy. And during the last Imbibliomancy episode that we did last semester, we discussed Kazuo Ishiguro's The Buried Giant. And Taylor and I derail the entire episode in the middle to discuss the papers that we wrote for the final class that we used that book for. And my entire paper was on genre. And like what genre that book is, because Kazuo Ishiguro got in a lot of trouble for saying, oh, are people going to think this is fantasy? Because he didn't think the book was fantasy, but it utilizes dragons and magic. Well, maybe. Debate. And Ursula K. Le Guin got really upset. And so there was an actual like war about what it was. And Kazuo Ishiguro saying, well, I wasn't using any of the tropes, but I was using the elements. And it's just like, so it's just really wacky. Like, yeah. A lot of people came out saying in that we live in a world where genre doesn't really matter anymore. But of course, if you're a book publisher or a bookseller, that's not true at all, because that's what my thesis that I'm writing right now is dealing with right now, and talking about young adults and how young adult books and how that works. So like, it's just really interesting how I think a lot of people would love to just be like, genre doesn't matter, but it does.
There's like definitely, I think there's definitely a lot of things. So another book club episode that we did was a Laurel K. Hamilton book, which was an Anita Blake book. She could not publish that book for the life of her, the first one in the 80s, because it didn't sit comfortably in a genre until a little bit later when a publisher was like, all right, this is good enough. We can market this because urban fantasy didn't exist at that time. And this was like a mixture of mystery and fantasy and contemporary, and they like didn't have a space for that. And she sort of sparked a lot of other writers like Jim Butcher to write in this kind of world. And like Anne Rice had been doing some stuff like the Interview with the Vampire stuff, but like a modern like vampires and vampire hunters and like things like that in our world didn't really exist. So I think that it is changing a little bit. Publishers are at times more open to cross-genre stuff, and they might stick it in the general fiction section, or they might be like, okay, fantasy has a huge overarching thing. There's so many different kinds of fantasy, and fantasy and science fiction often get lumped together, so those can kind of cross too. So to a point, it does, but it still sort of needs to get like the tag of this is for this age group, and it generally has this theme where you're talking about it's a romance, it's science fiction, it's fantasy, it's adult. Like those things just matter.
And I think but I think there's definitely a way to because even though fantasy and sci-fi get mushed together, if you pick up random books off the shelf instantly by looking at the cover, you can tell what kind of book you're looking at.
I think it has to do with the setting more than anything. Like the tropes are a thing, but I think that it's the setting. So like for the most part, general fiction is going to be either historical fiction or like contemporary fiction. Like those are like it's set today in our world. There's nothing fancy else going on. Maybe some slight magical realism, but it's for the most part just set in our world or set in our world in the past. Whereas fantasy is set in our world in the past with magic for the most part, or set in the anytime with magic, and then science fiction is set in the future with or without magic, depending.
Generally not as much magic as technology. Ish, generally.
Yeah. But then
That's what I like.
there's a lot of things with like aliens, and the aliens often have weird magic if you're going to do an alien
Mm-hmm.
thing. So there can be magic involved, but it's always set in the future.
I mean, that's why I like the term speculative fiction, because like all of these are just like books that ask what if.
Yeah.
You know, what if this happened? What if this existed? And I realized that neither of us, and this makes more sense for me, but less sense for you. Although maybe you did, you were cutting out a little bit. You didn't mention horror in your hierarchy.
Oh, I'm not sure. People don't read horror very much, I feel like. It's not popular, but I don't think it's particularly frowned upon at the same time.
It's like one of those niche things.
Yeah, it's more if
It's
you
just so interesting because like horror movies are such a big thing.
horror. So Stephen King's just in the general fiction section. Horror just goes in with the general fiction. Yeah, no, I think it just horror is considered part of just general fiction, I think. And it's a niche thing where you have to kind of know who writes it and where to get it.
And it's like historical fiction though too. Like
Yeah.
I legitimately think like some of these subgenres, like you can tell how much they're valued because they just get slotted in general fiction, and that's why I like didn't want to include general fiction in my hierarchy, because like I think that anything that either can't be categorized easily or doesn't have enough of a canon around it to get its own shelf just goes into general fiction. That's like it's the island of lost toys.
Like that's fair, yeah. And I mean, so at Barnes and Noble, where I also work because I am a woman of many hats, they I laughed at how silly the history section is there in the nonfiction section, because it's like, okay, history. Now you're gonna get history that's camera focus. Focus on me, camera. Camera? You can focus? There we go. History. War history, separated into each war. Each war gets its own shelf. Separated then into U.S. history and world history. Separated into parts of the world. Separated into religion. Separated into, like, there's so many, like, subsections, like, shelf by shelf. All of this, like, literally one shelf will have a little tag that says this. Whereas if you go in the general fiction section, there's none of that. It's all just organized alphabetically by author. Which seems so silly, like to be that specific with the nonfiction. So like you're not just saying this is a history book, but this is a history book about World War I in Poland. Like it gets so detailed there. And the same with the technology section and the nonfiction section of like this is about technology, portable Apple products, iPad. You know, like it gets all of these like specific sections get spaces, whereas in general fiction it's just all mushed. It's mushed.
That's what I mean though. Like I mean maybe you could pull out some horror and maybe you could pull out some historical fiction, but I feel like general fiction is like where you put what you can't explain, but like hasn't been called literary by someone. You know what I mean? Like so it would almost be impossible to section off the general fiction section.
But I mean literary fiction even goes in the general fiction section too. It's just pulled out by people and like marketed in a different way.
Yeah, but like how do you, because I think like literary fiction, I mean I've never really seen in particular a book like labeled literary fiction.
No.
Like I think that's a retroactively applied label.
Yes, it's a retroactively applied label. It usually applies to award nominees and winners and what is considered a modern classic. So modern classic is oxymoronic. A lot of those just get shoved into literary fiction, right? So like things by Ishiguro, probably literary fiction. Things by Toni Morrison, probably literary fiction, just because it's been by a group of intellectuals picked out as high quality writing about important issues generally, or about the human experience in particular.
Yeah. And I mean, sometimes those are even like brought out too, because sometimes bookstores will do like award-winning sections,
Yes.
like, and it'll be like a face-out display. So sometimes those are brought out, and they can bring them out in that way, like that.
Or I mean, like we were following the Man Booker. Just following a specific award and looking at the books that they're looking at will tell you generally what they're considering high literature, as opposed to just pop literature. Although I'm sure, I mean, there's awards for science fiction books and fantasy books and all of those specific genres as well. I don't think there's awards for romance books.
I think
That's
that there
part of,
is.
is there?
I think that there is, but I can't tell you what it is off the top of my head.
Because I don't know. I mean, I know there's awards for like women writers and like women's fiction, but I don't think that like.
I mean, I think that the problem though with the romance thing is that like they're for like literary romancy kind of things, like the people who but like the people who write like Harlequin are just always being shot in the foot. Like,
there's actual sexy times in this book. No.
I mean, it's like,
yeah,
it's like, I mean, I think for the longest time, just with like young adult literature, I would follow some of the young adult awards, and there's like this huge schism in young adult just between that, which is, I guess you could consider the more literary young adult fiction, which is usually written for like classroom or educational purposes, and then you have like the popular stuff that is like one of the biggest money makers in publishing right now, but it's like considered lesser than because it's popular.
right.
So like, and that's always an issue. Like, I feel like certain books, even if they are classics, get devalued when they become popular. So even like if you're just reading, like, I don't know, like say you picked up a classic, like I feel like sometimes people will try and belittle that by saying, oh, you're just reading it because you have to, or stuff like that. So
a lot of people, so I read somewhere that classics are great books to have in a bookstore, but terrible books for a library because people buy them to put on their shelves to seem like thoughtful and like cultured, but nobody actually reads them. So that's sort of a stem from that idea where like nobody would actually read classics unless they wanted to sound smart. They're not actually good. It's just a bunch of old dead white dudes saying stuff about stuff. Which is true. I mean, it's a fair argument. It is just a bunch of old dead white dudes for the most part.
I mean, I just love how like the genre hierarchy just like it devolves into a bunch of people trying to devalue everything and just being like, well, no, like this isn't good because this isn't good because this.
Right.
And then flip it on the other side, and like there's people going, well, this is good because this, and it's just like trying constantly to position their genre on top, and not necessarily like, I don't mean like the writers like don't necessarily, some of them do this, but like just being like people wanting to validate what they like, when the entire reason that we have these different genres is that so everyone can have something that they like, and it ends up being like divisive among readers.
So this was a huge problem that I had with the K-pop fandom. So I don't know if you've noticed, but I haven't been like, people who follow my blog might know that I used to do something called Sunday Spam, where I would make a playlist of new K-pop songs that I liked, and I followed them religiously. I watched the live shows and all of this stuff, and one of the reasons I stopped doing that is that the fandom got so scary because this sort of thing was happening, where people were like, my groups are better than your groups because of the XYZ, they've been around longer, or you didn't even like them until they were popular, so now they're dumb, and it's just because everybody likes that one song. I knew about them before that when they debuted, and it got like people were fighting with each other and like yelling at people and like not wanting to talk to people anymore because of this. And I was like, I was here for the music and the silly dances and like hair and stuff. Like, I'm not here for this infighting. And this is the exact same thing, that people who really care about a specific genre and feel like somebody else is putting down their genre for whatever reason will then turn it around and do the same to the other person. And it's like a defense mechanism. Like, no, I like the thing I like because it's the best thing, and therefore your thing cannot be the best thing, and it's not fair. One thing I did want to talk about is that most of the things at the bottom of that hierarchy were generally marketed at women. So romance, chick lit, young adult are all marketed at women.
Yup. And I mean, this is
table.
Well, because I mean, I just did a video about this a little while ago called "Where Is the YA for Boys?" and talking about how I really wanted to share my love of reading with my brother, but he jumped right from children's literature to adult fantasy because there was nothing for him in YA, and I felt that was a gap because YA really is like a lot of romance schlock right now. Like every single book has to involve a romance, and I actually just...
I'm going to grab a couple of YA books as examples. I'll be right back.
Okay. I actually just did a project for my thesis wherein I evaluated the last 60 books to top the Young Adult Library Services Association list. And out of all 60 books, only 9 had male protagonists. And of those 9 books, 8 of them did not include romance. So, like, there's this huge gap where any books for boys that are considered YA do not include romance. And that's how you literally know they're for boys, is because there's a lesser value on the romance or no value at all. Because, I don't know, I feel like, we don't need as many romance books, because why? I just want to read books that, friends. Why does everybody have to have a happily ever after at 16? I don't understand. That's not true.
True.
And ugh.
So here, I grabbed a couple of the young adult books that I'm getting rid of because I don't want them anymore. I'm going to be giving this one to Gretchen, so I'm sorry, folks, you won't be able to get these, but the rest of these are going to be in giveaways at some point, so you might want to see if you want one of those. But this is a book by Patrick Nuss that is one that I think is a young adult book for boys, or at least open to boys. The protagonist is a guy. There's only one girl in the story. Everybody else in the story is a man. So, like, definitely marketed at boys. And you know it's marketed at boys because there's no grills on the cover. It's just a knife. That's a boy thing. There's a knife. Along the same lines, we have It's Kind of a Funny Story by Ned Vicini, who passed away from suicide recently. And this book actually deals with mental health. Again, the protagonist is a boy. We get a boy and his, like, neighborhood, essentially. It's not a funny story at all, guys. It's actually very sad. But, so this is another one that I think is open to guys. It's more generic. Now, hold on. This Song Will Save Your Life is also focused on mental health, but is marketed at girls. It's got the pink spine. It's got a girl on the cover. Girly, right? I liked this one a whole lot better than this one because this one, the romance saved her. Because she fell in love with a boy and got valued by a boy, she didn't have to be sad and depressed anymore, guys. Whereas with yeah, I know. I did a review of this one, so if you want to go see my thoughts on this, I can show you. But this is kind of a funny story. It's not bad at all. There is romance in this one. He does meet a girl at the hospital that he goes to because of his mental issues, but it's not the romance that saves him. And then your general...
Also, hang on, I just want to say one thing. As we're talking about romance, we mean almost entirely heterosexual white.
Yes.
Heterosexual white.
Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, which is an A+ book. Highly recommended. Good YA. And then most of the books in young adult are going to look like this.
Hey, listen, I actually liked that one. It was cute.
I know, it was cute and fluffy, but like this is, if you walk in the YA section, you're going to see a bunch of clones of this, of like pastel books with couples on them with like romance and forever love as the main theme. And this is that whole section with like these hidden, probably spine out somewhere.
Yeah.
Like you're not gonna see these in that section.
I think I know what I need to do for my next From the Notebook video, because I've just finished a whole thesis chapter on YA book covers. So
okay. Yeah.
I think I know what I need to do, because it's 10 and I want to talk so much more.
Yeah. So yeah, we usually do these for half an hour. So it's been half an hour, and that was one of the things we wanted to talk about. And we might do something else along the similar vein at some point in the future. Again, we did this live, so if you missed that, that's fine. Please still talk to us about this in the comments below, because it's something that we think is important and maybe needs to change a little bit in the bookish community. Have you had any experiences where somebody has sort of shamed you for things that you like? I discussed my love of paranormal romance, which is doubly like shunned. Not only is it romance, but it's romance about vampires. So there's that, and then Gretchen obviously reads YA, which in the general fiction and adult fiction community is kind of looked down upon a lot. Even though here on BookTube it's super popular. There's plenty of YA readers, both adults and young adults and all of that stuff. And even in the adult community,
Perception versus consumption.
Yes, exactly. And even in the adult community, I've seen a lot of people who read YA in general, like the Reading Outlaw reads some YA, because I think she's a YA librarian, actually, or a children's librarian, and she reads a fair amount of that. And who else have I seen reading young adult? There's definitely people. My brain is not on it right now. It's late. I've been at work all day. Anyway, but yes, there's definitely people who read YA. Obviously, we read YA from time to time, but that's what we wanted to talk about, and we did it. And now I'm gonna go to bed.
Same.
Yeah. So we'll see you guys later. For our wrap-up, we'll be together. I might do a video on Friday. I have not decided whether I want to write it out as the post or not, and it's probably just going to come down to whether or not I have time.
Yep, same. I want to do one for Thursday, but...
Yep, exactly. I have Thursday off, though, so it is likely that this will be a video.
Not me.
You don't have Thursday off. I have to work Saturday, though, so there's that. Anyway.
All right. Bye.
If you want to talk to us, there's links in the description, comments, all that stuff. Bye, guys.